joy and a privilege to gather together around God's Word this evening. If you have your Bibles, I'd invite you to open up to the book of Genesis, as we'll start in chapter 37 this evening. And we continue tonight our chapter-by-chapter study through the book of Genesis, this book of beginnings that we've been looking at. And we move tonight into a new portion of this beginning history for the nation of Israel. And we move into a key section where we start to see God working in and through the lives of this particular people that He has called to Himself. And we continue really to see Him working in and through their lives. And you might recall from last week that we did reach the conclusion of the historical account's primary focus on Jacob, who was later renamed Israel. And we saw then how the Genesis narrative began to shift its attention away from Jacob and shift its attention then to the next generation after him. And we saw then how the 12 tribes of Israel have now been established with Jacob's 12 sons. And God's promises that He's been repeating over and over again for many descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, well, that's really starting to take shape and unfold as we've seen. But as the nation of Israel begins to take shape, it's been a very discouraging start from Jacob's sons, to say the least. After all, in chapter 35, verse 22, we saw that Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, he defiled his father's bed by laying with Jacob's concubine. And then right before that, in chapter 34, Jacob's second and third oldest sons, they responded to their sister being attacked. They responded with murder and kidnapping and plundering an entire city. And so the actions of these three first sons, they certainly raised concerns about this generation that was stemming from Jacob. And even in a certain sense, they start to raise some questions. Questions about how God might still be faithful to His many other promises with such a wicked generation, as we're starting to see here. But more clearly tonight in our passage this evening, we will see that God most certainly will fulfill His promises, just as He always does. But He will also do so in marvelous and miraculous ways that only the Creator and Savior of the world could ever draw up. You see, as we move now into chapter 37 of Genesis, it also means that we'll begin the historical account of the life of Joseph. Joseph being Jacob's 11th born son. And you hear that, 11th born son, you might start to think, well, what in the world could be so special about number 11? You know, we all know the stereotype, right? The middle child or the middle children, they tend to be the forgotten child, right? That's the stereotype. And so in a family of 12 sons, you might think that number 11, he would probably get lost in the fray pretty quickly, right? But as it turns out, Joseph is actually the favorite son of his father, and God has incredible plans for what He will accomplish through this particular son of Jacob. And as those plans unfold, really from chapter 37 all the way up until the end of Genesis, this text will provide one of the most stunning and awe-inspiring illustrations of God's providence in all of Scripture. You see, these events, they really exemplify God's purposeful sovereignty in action. And many would even point to Joseph's life as the preeminent Old Testament example of how God sovereignly works to accomplish His ends, and in particular, how God's sovereign will is accomplished even through the sin and wickedness of men. So we find here then a classic depiction of God's sovereignty working alongside human responsibility, as God even ordains evil so that He can then carry out good purposes through it in the end. And across this account, God will use the hatred and wickedness of Joseph's brothers and others to eventually place Joseph in a position of preeminent power and prominence within the nation of Egypt, so that he can use Egypt's resources to actually rescue this family later on. Or as Joseph himself tells his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20, he says to them, "As for you, with your hatred, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." And throughout all of this, God's providence working out in Joseph's life, well, Joseph proves to really stand out from among his brothers' wickedness that we've already seen. And he resists temptations, and we'll see that he even forgives his brothers for the misery that they set in motion with his life. But within the larger scope of Genesis, we'll learn also this evening that it's not just the physical rescue of Israel that God is working out here. And there's also still that ongoing plan for spiritual rescue that began all the way back in the garden, as God has promised a lineage that would lead to the Redeemer and rescuer of man from their sin. And while it's true that Joseph would be the son of Israel that would save God's people from physical certain death, it would be a different son that would carry forth this lineage of promise, and that would be Judah. That was Jacob's fourth oldest son. And in chapter 38 this evening, we will also see how God is providentially working through the wickedness of man, including in this case Judah himself, to still fulfill the perfect plans for that promise as well. You see, through Judah's immorality, a child would be born that would continue an ancestry that would one day lead to the most important child ever being born, namely Jesus the Messiah, who is God incarnate and the reconciler of man to God. And so there are really these two separate tracks related to God's sovereign plans simultaneously going on at once here in our passage. And we see here both plans for short-term physical rescue of Israel, and we see the long-term salvation of all God's people providentially unfolding in our passage this evening. And while there are certainly many numerous ways you could break down the outline of this passage, I think that those concurrent plans, they really best exemplify how chapters 37 and 38 work together. So across our passage this evening, we'll find God sovereignly working through two specific sons of Jacob to accomplish his salvific plans and purposes. In chapter 37, we'll look at the beginning of Joseph's trial, which God will again use for the more immediate rescue of the people of Israel. But then in chapter 38, the description of Judah's immorality, God will use as part of the eventual and ultimate rescue of all God's people. And so that's a bit about how those two chapters are working this evening, as God's grace and God's providence, even through man's wickedness, are on full display within these events that are set in motion in our passage tonight. And so with that in mind, let's jump into this incredible text here as we start with the opening of Joseph's account in chapter 37 of Genesis. And we'll read larger chunks tonight, but let's start here first in chapter 37 by reading verses 1 through 11 so you can see this. It says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered round and bowed down to my sheaf.' Then his brothers said to him, 'Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers, and said, Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. We find here across these verses some of the setting that's really laying the groundwork for what is to come. And the text opens for us in verse 1 by pointing out that Jacob's family is now fully settled back in Canaan, as we've seen. And then in verse 2, we find some very similar language and familiar language from Genesis as the new section is open with these words. It says, These are the records of the generations of Jacob. That word for generations, it's a common word in Genesis. It's the Hebrew word toledoth. And within this book, it commonly introduces genealogies, but also sometimes new units, often where the sons of the man that are mentioned there will become the main focus of that section. And that's really what we find here. So when we see the records of the generations of Jacob, what this really means is that these are the events surrounding Jacob's sons. And as we talked about, there will be a particular emphasis on Joseph. And we see that Joseph is going to receive the attention right away because the middle of verse 2 immediately moves from Jacob and right to Joseph. And we see that Joseph's account begins with him as a 17-year-old boy, a young man, coming back from the pasture, and it says there here that he delivers to his father what the text calls a bad report about his brothers. Now, we don't necessarily know the contents of that report, and we really don't even know Joseph's motives with this report, but really the point here is not so much about the report itself as much as it is about identifying really the first reason why his brothers are growing to hate him. This will be a hatred that is a key factor to what's going to happen later on to Joseph. And so Joseph's little reconnaissance here from verse 2, again, this becomes the first piece of kindling that is fueling their hatred that they have for him. But then verses 3 and 4 go on to describe even more for that fuel for that fire of their hatred. And we learn here that Joseph was the clear favorite of his father as well. And it seems that out of all of his sons, Israel, or Jacob's love for Joseph, well, it's blatantly a greater love, and it's expressed in greater ways than how he expresses his love for all the other brothers. And you can even see that with this gift that Jacob provides. It says that he gives his son Joseph, as verse 3 calls it, a vari-colored tunic. Now, despite all the different reimaginings or artistic renditions of how this garment might have been a technicolor dream coat, we really have no idea what this looked like. The Hebrew words, it simply describes a long sleeve robe. That's what the more literal translation would be. But despite whatever it looked like, it's still a unique gift nonetheless, and it's one that exemplifies Jacob's favoritism for Joseph over his other sons. Now, you would have thought that Jacob would have learned not to have such favoritism and to avoid these things, but he doesn't, and as a result, in verse 4, we see how Joseph's brothers saw how their father loved him the most, and the text says they hated him for it. And so along with that bad report that Joseph gave back in verse 2, now we have Israel's favoritism for him that's continuing to feed this quickly growing wildfire of hatred. But then there's even more fuel for the fire in verses 5 through 11. And we learn there that Joseph is now sharing his dreams that actually predict his future prominence and authority over his other brothers. And as expected, hearing from the man that they hate that they'll be his subjects one day, well, that doesn't go over very well. But before we get into the specifics of these dreams, I think it's important to first understand that in this day, and really with this particular family, they would have all understood the divine origin of these dreams that Joseph is sharing. You see, God had already spoken to this family multiple times directly through dreams. And that included, of course, their father's dream, Jacob's dream that he had in chapter 28 with the angelic ladder that goes up from heaven to earth. That was one example of how God spoke through dreams to this family. And even if they didn't like the message that Joseph is sharing from this dream, they would have understood that these visions, again, came directly from God. That's even why verse 11 highlights that they were jealous of him. So they might not have wanted to fully believe that this promise would come to pass, but they also knew that these dreams very well might mean that Joseph could indeed be exalted above them, just as the dreams said. And they hated him even more for it. And they were going to do whatever they could to prevent those prophecies from coming true, as we'll see. And so already really here we're starting to see God's providence unfolding in the events, because again, these are dreams that God provided, and the dreams that he provided to Joseph, well, these are just another factor in why his brothers hate him and why his brothers would eventually sell him into Egyptian slavery, which was right exactly where God wanted him to be. So it's very fascinating to track God's providence unfolding through these events. But as far as the content within these dreams themselves, basically the passage notes two separate dreams that really have the same primary takeaway. The first one from verse 7, it describes agricultural imagery, and we see that Joseph's sheaf, which is really just a bundle of grain, his sheaf rose up while his brother's sheaves bowed down to his in subordination. And then there's a second dream in verse 9, and that's really using celestial imagery. And so the sun and the moon, probably representing Joseph's parents, and the 11 stars, meaning his 11 brothers, they all bow down before Joseph once again in submission and subordination. And so the message here was clear that Joseph was going to be elevated into a position of authority and rulership over the rest of his family. And that would, of course, ultimately be fulfilled in Egypt, as only Pharaoh would one day rank above Joseph. And all people, including Joseph's family, would be under his rulership. And we'll see later on in Genesis that Joseph's brothers would literally bow down before him one day, just as is prophesied here. But with this prediction of Joseph's future prominence that comes from these dreams, well, now at this point, the burning fire of their hatred, it has at this point reached full intensity. Joseph's bad report and their father's favoritism, well, that was one thing. But now that Joseph himself was predicting his future authority over them, well, their hatred had reached peak heights. And verse 8 even affirms once again that they hated him even more. And so we find here this snowballing progression of growing hatred that will very soon overflow into murderous ideas where they want to kill their own flesh and blood. And so instead of a humility that would have rejoiced with Joseph over his blessings, well, they wanted to try to cut down their brother. But then in contrast to Joseph's brothers, we see a little bit of a different result from Jacob, his father. And verse 11 notes that Jacob, it says that he kept the saying in mind. And even though he did rebuke Joseph, he probably initially perceived his dreams to be foolishness. But with that last phrase there in verse 11, it seems to imply that Jacob humbly considered the possibility of what God was promising here in these dreams. And Jacob was looking at his own life, and he knew what God had done in his own life, and he's considering how God worked in his life and thinking these things might indeed come to pass in Joseph's life. But Joseph's brothers, they would have none of it, and their hatred for him, again, would be such that they even wanted him dead, which is what we see reflected in the next section of this introduction to the Joseph account here in chapter 37. And so verses 1 through 11, they basically laid the foundation of the hatred that would then drive the events that we'll see across the rest of the chapter. So this is going to be a little bit of a longer section, but I want to go ahead and read the remainder of Genesis 37 so you can see how this unfolds. So this will be verses 12 through 36 across the rest of the chapter. Starting in verse 12, it says, "Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them.' And he said to him, 'I will go.' Then he said to him, 'Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me.' So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, 'What are you looking for?' He said, 'I am looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock.' Then the man said, 'They have moved from here, for I heard them say, "Let us go to Dothan." So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him in one of the pits, and we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood, and they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Then he examined it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And so there you see the events providentially unfolding, which led to Joseph becoming a servant in Potiphar's house in Egypt. And across this account, we've really seen how Joseph went from the highest of highs. He's enjoying life in his father's home as the favorite son, and he's the recipient of these wonderful promises and dreams and visions of future prominence, to then being brought down to the lowest of lows. And he's thrown into a pit by his own brothers. He's sold into slavery, and he's sent off to a distant land that is filled with godless people. And his brothers' hatred had led to a truly harsh and difficult situation for Joseph. But, as we'll see, a situation that after several more ups and downs would eventually again lead to him being appointed to second in command over the most powerful nation in the entire world at that time. But it all begins here with his hateful brothers first wanting to kill him, but throwing him in a pit and deciding to sell him instead, as we've seen across this chapter. Now, with what we just read, the unfolding of these events here, it's pretty straightforward. I just want to highlight some of the specifics of what we see. Again, his difficulties began as his father Israel. He sent him to check in on the brothers in the flock, and he wanted him to bring back another report to him. That was, of course, a report that would never come because Jacob was unknowingly and naively sending his favorite son directly into the burning fire of his brother's hatred. But then Joseph first travels to Hebron, about 50 miles to the north to Shechem. You might recall from last week that this was the same location that Jacob's other sons had their murderous rampage in response to their sister's assault. And so basically what it seems like is now that they've wiped out the male population from that territory, the territory is wide open for them to pasture the flocks. But as we saw, Joseph doesn't find them there in Shechem, and he's directed instead a few more miles further to Dothan, and that's where he eventually tracks them down. But this is where things turn south really quickly, and I want you to take another look just at verses 18 through 20, and look at what his brothers say as he's approaching. It says there in verse 18, it says, "When they saw him from a distance and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams.'" And so you can really just sense their venomous hatred for their own brother. And they mock him for his dreams. And they plan to cut his life short so that those dreams won't come to pass. In the text, it makes no uncertainties about the fact that they plotted and they are premeditating how they might kill their own brother. They had every intention of murdering him and then covering it up. And ironically enough, they were wanting to kill the very man that later on would rescue them from their own certain death. But before they can follow through on their plans, we saw in verses 21 to 24 that the oldest brother, Reuben, intervenes. Now again, this is the same Reuben who had slept with his father's concubine, probably in an attempt to usurp his father. But before we start to think that there's been some major turn from wickedness for Reuben, if you look down at verse 30, we start to see a hint of his true motives here. Look what he says there after returning to find Joseph had been sold. It says, "He returned to his brothers, and he said, 'The boy is not there.' Look at this. 'As for me, where am I to go?'" But then he immediately proceeds to go along with the plan to trick their father into thinking Joseph is dead. And so it seems really that Reuben's motives here are less about trying to save his brother out of love for him, and they're more about a love for himself and trying to protect his own skin. And even though verse 22 does explain that Reuben planned to rescue and restore Joseph to their father, as the oldest son, it's important to understand that the murder of Joseph would have rested mostly on his shoulders. And the last thing that Reuben needed at this point was to offend his father even more than he already had. And so even with that, it seems to be a self-focus implied here on the part of Reuben, as he likely stopped his brothers only in an effort to protect himself from consequences. But regardless of his motives, though, his intervention, the reality is his intervention does at least deliver Joseph's life from the murderous rage of his brothers. And so instead of being dead, at the end of verse 24, we find that Joseph is stripped of his tunic, that same one that his father gave him, and he's thrown into this empty pit. Now it's interesting, what we don't see here in this account at all is a single word from Joseph with this whole scene. But Genesis 42:21 will explain later on that Joseph was pleading with them during this time in his distress, and all during that they ignored him. And so basically what was happening is that they're apathetically sitting there while he's shouting out for mercy. In fact, the beginning of verse 25 even says that they sat down to eat a meal. This really speaks to their hardness of hearts and just how callous they are at this point in their conscience. They have no concern, no care for their brother of any kind. But then as God's providence would have it, well, an opportunity arose for them to still get rid of their hated brother but they wouldn't have to kill him. And we see that the caravan of traders is passing by here, and that would be the means that God would use to get Joseph to Egypt. Now it's interesting, in verse 25, these human traffickers are called Ishmaelites. That, of course, means that they would have been descendants of Joseph's great-uncle Ishmael. But then in verse 28, the traders are also called Midianites, and Midianites would have descended from Abraham's other son, Midian, who came from his marriage to Keturah. Genesis 25:2 tells us that. Now, there's some debate around why the text is alternating between Ishmaelites and Midianites here, but most commentators agree basically that these two terms are somewhat overlapping descriptions of the same group. And so basically what we find here is this intermingled caravan of this extended family of Joseph that ends up purchasing and selling him to Egypt. But either way, as this group is passing by, Joseph's brothers, we see him taking advantage of this opportunity, but this time it's not Reuben, it's Judah. And he speaks up and he initiates this idea of selling Joseph instead of killing him. And he basically makes two arguments to his brothers for why his plan is a better plan. First of all, he says that there's no profit in simply killing Joseph. They wouldn't make any money, but if they sold him, they could make some money. But then secondly, in verse 27, it seems that he does at least acknowledge that Joseph is their own flesh. He's their own brother. He's their own blood. And he might even be implying that it would be wrong to kill him in light of that. It's okay to sell him, apparently, but maybe it's wrong to kill him. And so Judah's idea, again, this ensures that Joseph won't die on that day and that his life will continue, but certainly his reasons also are far from pure and holy. And we'll see some more from Judah later on, but this is certainly a rough start for the father of the messianic tribe of Israel as well. But now at this point, Joseph is now a slave. His brothers are 20 shekels of silver richer. And after Reuben returns and he finds out what happens, the cover-up begins. They place the goat's blood on Joseph's tunic, and they make it look like this wild beast has killed him. That way their father won't suspect that they were involved in any way. And the ploy, of course, worked. Jacob is fully convinced that Joseph was dead, and his grief over the death of his favorite son, well, we see here it's simply insurmountable for him. Nobody could comfort this distraught father, the text says. And he even vows here to take this mourning and this despair all the way to his grave in Sheol. And quite likely it is true that Jacob held on to this grief for the next 20 plus years, up until he finally learned that Joseph was actually still alive. And Genesis 45:27 will describe Jacob's spirit being revived by that news of his son being alive. But again, at this point, Joseph is gone, and in their hatred, we've seen how his brothers have successfully gotten rid of their object of jealousy, their own brother. And at the same time, again, God is providentially using their wickedness to send Joseph exactly where he wants him to be. And while it's true that Joseph's trials have only just begun, again, things are right on track for the perfect plans that God has for his people. And that's what we'll see play out in the coming weeks, Lord willing. But with the remainder of our time this evening, I want to move on now to chapter 38 here in Genesis. And here in chapter 38, we actually find a break in the Joseph account. We see here that the narrative hits pause on what's going on with Joseph, and the text briefly shifts its attention to another one of Jacob's 12 sons, namely Judah. But as I alluded to earlier, while this chapter might initially seem like an unwelcomed interruption from the Joseph account, within the broader flow of Genesis, what we're seeing are two separate plans sovereignly unfolding at the same time. You have Joseph, through whom God will save Israel's family from death and famine by bringing them to Egypt, where they would greatly multiply. But now we look closer at Judah, through whom God will carry forth that lineage of promise that will lead to the salvation of all God's people. But in order to get there, the events leading to the birth of Judah's descendants that extend this lineage, these events will be wicked, to say the least. And we find here in Genesis 38 such pervasive immorality that one commentator even described it as one of the most sordid chapters in the Bible. And Judah's unfortunate immorality, well, this will also stand out as a stark contrast for Joseph's piety and Joseph's purity that he'll show in Egypt later on. And yet, just like the Joseph account, we'll find that God is working in and God is working through the sins of men to accomplish, in this case, eternal good in the end. And we'll see that Judah and his son Perez, well, they're in fact listed in the very genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. And so let's go ahead and take a look now to see how this will unfold. And we'll start here in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 38, which again is the setup for what's going on here with Judah and his family. So chapter 38, verse 1, it says, "And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Ur. Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for Ur, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Ur, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, 'Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother.' Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, 'Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up,' for he thought, 'I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers.' So Tamar went and lived in her father's house." Well, you can quickly see here with these events how that wickedness of the generation after Jacob, well, it's quickly spilling over now into the next generation after that as well. And we see that two of Judah's sons, these are Jacob's grandsons, well, they're so wicked that God ended both their lives early. But really, the start of the problems for Judah's family, they seem actually to begin with Judah himself, because what we see here is that he chose to intermarry with the Canaanites. And that goes against the God-honoring pattern of his forefathers who had left Canaan to find their spouses. Nevertheless, out of that marriage to a Canaanite woman comes these three sons for Judah, the oldest of whom ends up marrying Tamar. Now, we don't know the exact nature of Ur's evil here that caused God to end his life, but we do get a little bit more detail on his brother Onan's wickedness, and we see what led to his untimely demise. And when Judah commands Onan in verse 8, he tells him there, he says, "Perform his duty as her brother-in-law." What he's alluding to there, that this will be formalized in Deuteronomy 25, but this is the practice that's known as levirate marriage. We see this practiced in the book of Ruth as well, if you're familiar, when she marries Boaz. But essentially what this entails is that when a married man dies without children, well, his brother or his closest male relative is obligated to then marry the widow and to provide a child to her that will carry on the deceased brother's name. This firstborn child would legally belong to the deceased man, and this would be a means to uphold his honor and his inheritance. And this practice was also a means to ensure that the widow would be honored and cared for as well. And so that's what he's describing here. But as for Onan, when Judah commands him to perform this duty, well, we see here that he's all too happy and all too willing to engage in sexual intercourse with Tamar. But what he's not willing to do is fulfill his obligations to her and to his deceased brother, because he withdraws from her to ensure that there will be no conception and that there will be no child that's not his. And so he selfishly withholds honor from both Ur and Tamar, and he also selfishly uses Tamar for his own gratification. And for that sin, this selfish neglect of his duties and his responsibilities, well, that's what God ended his life early for. And so both brothers here face deadly consequences for their sin. But at this point, we see here that Judah, he seems blind to the evil of his sons, and it seems as though he thinks Tamar is the problem. And while he told Tamar in verse 11 to wait for his third son to come of age, in reality, he never really planned to give him to Tamar in marriage. And so in short, Judah lied to her, and with this action, he's essentially abandoning her, and he's leaving her destitute and leaving her in danger by not providing a sufficient substitute husband for her. And Tamar, well, she'll eventually realize what's going on here. She realizes that Judah is lying to her, that he doesn't intend to fulfill his promises, and that's what leads us to what happens next. So let's read verses 12 through 19 now together to see how this unfolds. It says, "Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers in Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, 'Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep.' So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, 'Here now, let me come in to you,' for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, 'What will you give me that you may come into me?' He said, 'Therefore I will send you a young goat from the flock.' She said, 'Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it?' He said, 'What pledge shall I give you?' And she said, 'Your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand.' So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments." And so really that's where you see within this account the specifics of Judah's immorality with who he thought was a prostitute, but was actually his widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar. And she took steps here to secure the protection and the honor that Judah had been withholding from her. And verse 14 even affirms that he now also was holding back his third son, Shelah, from marrying her, even though he had promised to give him to her. And so Tamar realizes what's going on here. She disguises herself. She makes herself available to the recently widowed Judah. And she's hoping that through him, this family's obligations to her will actually be fulfilled. And yet it's interesting, Tamar really had no idea whether her plan would work. She had no idea whether she would actually become pregnant from this one single encounter with Judah. But it's in that unknown where we again start to see God's sovereignty reflected in this account. He's providentially using this immoral act to bring about the continuation of Judah's line. And so you might say, what Judah meant for evil, well, God meant for good. And as for Judah's part in all of this, it is worth noting that while it's true that Tamar set up the situation, verse 16 makes it clear that it was Judah who actively turned aside and pursued her for immorality. And the full extent of his lustful desire, well, that's made clear by his willingness to offer her his seal, his cord, and his staff. And you might not see this right away, but by giving this as a pledge for the goat that he was planning to compensate later on, basically what he's doing is he's giving to her the things that are going to be most valuable to a man in that day. These are the main forms of personal recognition and identification. Basically, commentators alluded to this being like giving someone your driver's license, your social security card, and your birth certificate all as a deposit. And so as you can imagine, there was no doubt that he would indeed come back for these items later on to make that promised payment. Well, let's keep reading then to see what happens when he does try to pay this so-called harlot. And so take a look now at verses 20 through 26. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, "Where's the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." So he returned to Judah, and he said, "I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, 'There has been no temple prostitute here.' Then Judah said, 'Let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her.' Now it came about 3 months later that Judah was informed, 'Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry.' Then Judah said, 'Bring her out and let her be burned.' It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, 'I am with child by the man to whom these things belong.' And she said, 'Please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these.' Judah recognized them and said, 'She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, to Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again.'" And so we see first here at the beginning of this section, when Judah attempts to fulfill that pledge to pay Tamar with a goat, he enlists this friend, probably because he's too embarrassed to go by himself. And his friend is unable to find this alleged prostitute, and nobody else has seen of or heard of her either. And rather than facing further embarrassment, well, Judah abandons his treasured items that he left with her as a deposit, and he cuts his losses, and he leaves the humiliating situation alone, thinking that it will now go away. But it doesn't go away. It's not over yet. And 3 months later, word gets back to him that Tamar is now pregnant. Now, obviously, at this point, Judah has no idea that he is the father. And he just assumes that she's been immoral. And so we see there at the end of verse 24 that he calls for her in consequence to be burned. Now there's obvious hypocrisy in Judah's sentencing for Tamar there, because he pronounces a death penalty for her immorality, and yet he basically thinks no big deal of his own. But then, as we saw in verse 25, Judah would, of course, be fully exposed for his hypocrisy. And when Tamar is brought forth for judgment, she produces Judah's belongings that reveal him to be the father of her child. And in effect, what she does there is she vindicates her pregnancy to be legitimate. Because what's happening now is a man from Judah's family, in this case, of course, the widowed Judah himself, well, a man from that family did, in fact, fulfill the duties of levirate marriage with her as required. You see, Judah should have given her his youngest son in marriage, but as it stood, she had to deceive Judah to get him to perform this family's responsibilities and obligations. But what we see with Judah, as soon as he realizes his guilt, well, he does indeed acknowledge how he wronged Tamar. Look again what he says first there in verse 26. He says, "She is more righteous than I." And so his tune, it quickly changes from burn her to now her righteousness is greater than even mine. Now, with his words, he's certainly not condoning her deception by any means, but at this point, what his point is here is that comparatively speaking, she is the one who's in the right in this situation. He had neglected her by not giving his youngest son to her in marriage, and the guilt for this situation, well, it rested on him alone. That's what he's saying here. And so what we find then is that Judah is starting to show some potential signs of humility. This is a bit of a confession here of prideful and sinful self-righteousness. And this is a first from that generation after Jacob. And we'll see some more from Judah later on related to this, as it seems like later on he also will take ownership for what he did to Joseph as well. But as for chapter 38 here, well, these events are not quite done yet. And really, it's here at the end. This is really where things start to come together here, the major purpose behind what's going on here. And so let's look at the close of the chapter starting in verse 27. It says, "It came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place that while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, 'This one came out first.' But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, 'What a breach you have made for yourself.' So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah." And so the encounter we learn here between Judah and Tamar, well, it providentially results in the birth of twins. And these twins are delivered with a birth that's not too dissimilar to what we saw with Jacob and Esau, a very traumatic birth to say the least. But it's through this birth, and particularly through Judah's son Perez, that we finally see a key purpose for all this immorality across Genesis 38. And yes, it's true that the text further reveals increasing wickedness for the generations that follow Jacob. This is a wickedness, again, that will make the righteous and faithful Joseph stand out even more in the coming chapters. Although all those things are true, but even more importantly, as it relates to God's ultimate plan to reconcile man to himself, well, the lineage of the Redeemer would now extend through Judah and Perez. And God used these events to fulfill his promises that would eventually lead to the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. And incredibly, we don't have time to turn there, but we actually see Judah, Perez, and Tamar, all three listed in the Matthew 1 genealogy of Christ. Incredibly. And so it's a difficult account to read about here in Genesis 38 with all this immorality, this pervasive immorality. But we see at the end of it incredible purposes of what God was working out all along. And this becomes an amazing picture of God's sovereignty to faithfully fulfill his promises even through this wickedness. And so Genesis 38, this is just another piece of the puzzle that when you put it together, it reveals the beauty of how God is providentially accomplishing all that he said he would, even way back in the garden. And that greater understanding of and a greater appreciation for God's faithfulness and God's sovereignty and God's goodness, well, that really becomes the key takeaway from a passage like this, the details of this passage. These are wicked events, no doubt, but they have incredible outcomes that come from them in the end. And so if you're not already, it's my hope that you will be amazed and that you will marvel at the providence of God by the time that we finish this book of Genesis. And also, too, as we look at our own lives and we look at God providentially working in our own circumstances, even the wickedness and even the evil that's done against us, my desire is that we will, through this account, through what's happening with examples like this, that we will be fully convinced that our good God is faithfully and sovereignly working out our spiritual best interest through it all. And we will continue to see that reality unfold across the rest of the Joseph account in coming weeks, Lord willing. But for now, let's close by praying together. Lord, what an incredible picture of your goodness and your sovereignty rising above the wickedness of men. And really with these two examples of Joseph's brother and their intense hatred for him that overflowed into murderous desires, as well as Judah's immorality with his own daughter-in-law, just wicked and immoral things that we see in these accounts, and yet, Lord, incredible things that you worked out through them in the end. And so this study will really be a helpful depiction of your sovereignty working alongside human responsibility, as those who are evil in the midst of these events will be held accountable for it. You are a perfectly just God, even through these things. And so, Lord, this is a wonderful depiction of really the full manifold of your character attributes. And I pray, Lord, that we would worship you for it, that we would be convinced from the truths of Scripture of who you are and all that you've accomplished for our good, Lord, and that we would praise you for all that you've done. Help us to just be humbled by these things, and help us to be so immensely grateful for you and for your kindness. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.